It's with great pleasure that I introduce our first speaker this evening, and that is Kevin Gilvary. He is our honorary president. He is also famed in the world of Oxfordiana for being the editor of one of the great seminal texts of our thesis, and that is called Dating Shakespeare's Plays, a critical review of the evidence. It's the only book-length study of the date of Shakespeare's plays, and it is absolutely brilliant. Those who want to look at it can find it online, and very shortly it'll be back in print for people to buy readable copies. We're very excited to hear Kevin, who's about to talk on the subject of the theatre and the folly. By the folly, we can well assume that he means Fisher's Folly, the great house of the idiot builder Jasper Fisher, who went bust and sold it to the Earl of Oxford. So over to you, Kevin.
It is indeed a great honour for me to be president of the De Vere Society during this exciting venture. The DVS has been making great strides recently, both in developing new social media as well as continuing our exciting and rigorous research. For their insights on the theatre and of folly and other topics, I would like to give a few special welcomes. A good afternoon to Jan Cole in Castle Hedingham, a midday hello to Cheryl Egan Donovan in Boston, Massachusetts, an early morning wake-up call to Earl Sharman in Oregon, and a midnight greeting to Jane Nelson in Adelaide, Australia. Welcome to you one and all. I would like to set the scene in April 1580, just a week before Oxford's 30th birthday, when the following frightening event happened. It came at eve as April day shut up its watery eye and filled all London with dismay and that all sudden lie. In open street did all men meet, leaving their houses shaking fearfully. The bells as of themselves did toll, the knell of all the people. Huge stones fell down and others roll from tower top and from steeple. This was the first account of a famous earthquake which shook London on the 6th of April, 1580, and it was provided in a broadsheet ballad that was published the very next day. Another person to give an account of the event was Thomas Churchyard, who was actually watching some entertainment in the theatre at the moment the quake struck. He wrote this: "A number being at the theatre in the curtain at Holywell, beholding the plays, were so shaken, especially those that stood in the highest rooms and standings, that they were not a little dismayed, considering that they would no way shift for themselves unless they would, by leaping, hazard their lives or limbs, as some did indeed, leaping from the standings." Other writers published accounts of the 1580 quake, and interestingly, many of those writers were associated with Oxford. Thomas Churchyard himself was a soldier of fortune in the Falstaff mode and had been employed by Oxford to report on events in the Netherlands. Another writer was Arthur Golding, Oxford's uncle and translator of its Metamorphoses. Then we have an account by the writer Thomas Twine, who dedicated his translation of the Breviary of Britain to Earl of Oxford. Anthony Munday was yet another member of the Oxford Circle. He gave a short account of the earthquake, adding a list of grisly murders and other signs of God's displeasure. And then there was Abraham Fleming, who collected various reports and published them together 2 months later. The publisher, not a fly-by-night, was Henry Denham, highly respected, who was responsible for both editions of Holinshead. So, Oxford's connections with at least 5 scholarly writers whose accounts of the earthquake were published together is truly remarkable. It constitutes clear evidence that Oxford was at the centre of a very important literary coterie. And we'll be hearing more about some of those writers later today. But first, let us recall Oxford's theatrical interests in the late 1570s and early 1580s. About half a mile north of the city of London lay Holywell Priory, or to give it its full name, the Augustinian Priory of St. John the Baptist at Holywell. The church itself had a spire, and the priory enclosed about 3 acres of land. One of the last ecclesiastical events to occur there was the first marriage of John 16th of Oxford, 16th Earl of Oxford, and his first wife, Dorothy Neville. That happened on the 3rd of July, 1536. Soon afterwards, the foundation was dissolved and the property split up. After passing through various owners, Leicester's men acquired the lease on land and buildings in the northwest corner. There, they constructed a wooden theatre. Within a year, another party acquired the southeast corner of the precinct at Holywell and constructed another theatre, the Curtain, taking its name from the outer wall of the original priory. I argue that the development of the Curtain Theatre was guided by Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. Now on this slide, we can see the location of these purpose-built theatres. They're highlighted in blue at the top of the map, just north of where Liverpool Street Station lies today. Now to the west of the city was Savoy Hospital, which had been founded by Henry VII for the poor, needy and infirm. By the 1570s, the main rooms were let to various noblemen, and Oxford came to occupy the Master's Room in the late 1570s. At the bottom right, in brown, we see the Tower of London. Now you will recall that Oxford spent a few weeks at Her Majesty's pleasure in 1581 there. In the centre, highlighted in green, is the old St Paul's Cathedral, centre of the book trade. Leading down from St Paul's to the river lies Peter's Lane, where Oxford lived from about 1590. Alexander will be telling us more about this site. Returning to Holywell in blue, this was a very clever choice of location for Leicester to locate his playing company. It lay just outside the jurisdiction of the City of London, and also the priory still retained its status as a liberty beyond the powers of the Middlesex magistrates. Regarding the establishment of the theatre and the curtain, the standard view has been that acting companies were now able to play regularly to the paying public. However, I think this was a secondary effect of the establishment of the theatre. The main purpose that Leicester ran a company of players was to mount prestigious performances before the Queen and court, not just for his own glory, but also to influence the Queen. Just the previous year, in 1575, Leicester had presented lavish entertainments at Kenilworth. Now, with their dedicated base at the theatre, Leicester's men could park their pageant wagons, the Elizabethan equivalent of a juggernaut. They could stable their horses. They could plan and rehearse their entertainments away from prying eyes. They could store the most valuable items in their possessions. Those were the costumes. They could store their play scripts. Apart from the master's script, each character's part was written on a roll of paper. At the end of the performance, the company manager would retrieve these rolls so as to keep them together, presumably putting them in some kind of sack or a trunk. As the company's repertoire of plays expanded, so they needed more sacks or more trunks, which in turn needed more storage space. Finally, they could play for money, a useful little earner for Leicester's men, but subordinate to their main function of performing at court. These opportunities applied equally well to the development of the curtain. The curtain never had the prestige of the theatre. Presumably it was established for the same reasons. And I suggest that in 1577, Oxford was emulating Leicester, that two lords were maintaining covert bases for their acting companies. In fact, Oxford was establishing a base for an adult company before he even acquired the actual players. He was also establishing a base to use as a fencing school. Right, if we move on to slide 7, we see that the area is currently under development for a huge complex to be known appropriately as the Stage. So this is what it should be looking like in a couple of years' time. It's progressing well, and the latest plan includes a visitor centre showcasing the remains of the Curtain Playhouse, so that we will soon be standing on a glass platform directly above the stage on which Oxford produced the plays. We must also bear in mind that by far the most important reason for a nobleman such as Leicester or Oxford to run a company of players was to perform at court, to raise their own standing, to demean others, influence policy. In this picture, we see a figure looking very like John Dee as Prospero, charming the Queen and the court. During the 1570s, Oxford was renowned for composing a series of successful plays. Just a few days before the earthquake shook London, he took over Warwick's Men from Ambrose Dudley. His troupe, now known as Oxford Men, included John and Lawrence Dutton and Jerome Savage, very important actors. Soon afterwards, they were joined by Anthony Munday, probably as an actor or maybe as an actor manager. During a temporary sojourn in the Tower of London, Oxford continued to produce plays, and by 1582, Leicester's Men and Oxford's Men were the two most prominent companies at court. Their rivalry was, however, curtailed in 1583. With the Lord Chamberlain, Thomas Radcliffe, Earl of Sussex and ailing health, Francis Walsingham set up the Queen's Men by taking the best actors from various companies, especially Leicester's and Oxford's. Instead of being rivals and trying to gain their own prestige and influence at court, They were now working for the prestige and influence of the Privy Council. The Queen's Men was a new super company, but they still needed to rehearse and prepare. Where better than before a public audience at a venue such as the theatre or the Curtain? Indeed, in December 1583, the Privy Council instructed the Lord Mayor of London to allow such rehearsals. Their order reads, "The Council, considering that without frequent exercise of such plays as were to be presented before Her Majesty, her servants, the Queen's Men, could not conveniently satisfy her recreation and their own duty, desired that they should be licensed to perform upon weekdays and work days." So, Privy Council realising the importance of rehearsal and practice before they performed at court. We believe that for the Queen's Men from 1583 onwards, Oxford was employed to write patriotic historical plays for them. They performed at court and also at theatre at Shoreditch and on tour in England. The Curtain, which was sort of the lesser of the two, seemed to be available for hire. Other playing companies went there and fencing matches used it. Now, let's just remind ourselves of some of the locations with regards to Fisher's Folly. To the north of the city in blue were the theatre and the Curtain. The location of Oxford's lodgings is Savoy Hospital over on the west, and they were not convenient for the Curtain. So in 1580, within a week or so of the earthquake, Oxford acquired a large property nearby, Fisher's Folly. The owner, one Jasper Fisher, had died in 1579, and Oxford acquired the lease. 2 years later, he bought it outright. The Folly was located just outside the city walls, next to present-day Liverpool Street Station, and most importantly, near the theatres. Fisher's Folly is highlighted in yellow beyond the city walls. It lay to the east or the right of the Great North Road, just outside Bishopsgate. John Stowe describes the mansion in lavish terms, calling it a large and beautiful house with gardens of pleasure, bowling alleys, and sumptuously builded. The property included 20 cottages, 30 gardens, and 10 orchards. I presume by 30 gardens, they mean kitchen gardens. Oxford owned Fisher's Folly for most of the 1580s, and here he seems to have organised a writing circle. Now, the most important thing that writers need is a pub. And in fact, there are two pubs nearby, the Dolphin and the Pie Inn. We can see the Pie Inn, the Dolphin's just a bit above. The nearest church was directly opposite, St. Bottles without Bishopsgate. This was the parish church of Elizabeth Bassano Lanier, where she was baptised and where she was married. And it's possible, and perhaps quite likely, that she was part of the coterie. Another lady with educated taste and a reputation for wit was Anne Vavasor. So perhaps when she had fallen from the Queen's favour, she too might have attended the school. And we recall that she gave birth to Oxford's son the following March. So therefore, at the same time as he's developing Fisher's Folly, he is conducting an affair with Vavasor. Thanks to Colin Jolly for this and to Jan Cole. It was published in the De Vere Society newsletter a while ago. Fisher's Folly is highlighted in yellow, and adjoining it in browny orange is a tract of land known as the Great Garden of Christchurch. This tract was close to the theatre inns outside Aldgate and the Whitechapel Road, which leads eastwards to Chelmsford and directly onto Castle Hedingham. Oxford was now able to dedicate his interest as patron of his own writing company with a chance for his companies to perform at the Boar's Head, probably named after the family, but maybe going back a few generations, and the George Inn, and there are smaller venues further along, Red Lion, which has just been excavated. Oxford retained these two ones, the yellow one and the brown one, for most of the 1580s, a period crucial for the development drama leading to Shakespeare's plays. Right, let's move on to the members of Oxford's writing circle. I think the two most important ones, Alexander would probably disagree. I think two of the most important were John Lilly. He was the author of the highly acclaimed Euphues text, which had a great influence on the style of Shakespeare. During the 1580s, Lilly composed plays which were performed by Oxford's Children's Company at court. He seems to be associated with Oxford from the 1570s, as he was living in Savoy when Oxford was still there. Harvey calls Lilly the full master of the theatre, and Oxford's Minion Secretary. Second person who I think was most important was Anthony Munday. He had travelled on the continent and translated plays and romances. In the dedication of Primalion of Greece in 1619, Munday de Vere, 18th Earl, that Munday had served that most noble Earl your father, famous and desertful memory, and translated diverse honourable histories into English out of French, Italian and other languages, which he, Edward de Vere, graciously pleased to countenance with his noble acceptance. While the 17th Earl was alive, Munday dedicated various works to him, including Mirror Mutability, Zelauto and Palmerin. Now, we just had Thomas Churchyard describing the earthquake. He was a wide-ranging author known for his tavern wit. He was fat, he was jolly, and he almost certainly appeared in plays, first as Falstaff in The Merry Wives, and then as Oldcastle in the Henry IV plays. During the 1580s, Churchyard published a wide variety of texts, including, which I only found out recently, a translation of Ovid's Laments from Exile, which we were talking about the other day as being quite important. Right, a fourth one was Thomas Nash, a noted satirist who confirmed that Oxford obtained high fame by his pen, being the first in our language I have encountered that repurified poetry from art's pedantism, and that instructed it to speak courtly. Nash wrote of the selected good scholars, 17 poets and playwrights who had been patronised by Oxford. 17 poets and playwrights. Now this is a turn up for the books which Alexander's put on to me, and something which I greatly underestimated before. In the next few talks, we're going to hear about 4 more members of Oxford's literary circle. Alexander Fleming, one of the main contributors to the Chronicles of Holinshead. Holinshead died in 1582, and Fleming was the one who brought out the second edition. Eddie Jolly will be telling us about his writing activities. Then there's Thomas Watson, an overlooked poet and translator who adapted poems from French, Italian and Latin models and put them into elegant English. We'll be hearing from Ian Johnson about him. And Thomas Kidd, a promising playwright. Alexander will inform us more about Kidd's patronage that he got from an unnamed lord. And then, of course, there's Christopher Marlowe, who has an intriguing connection to Oxford. Now, if you are going to buy one more book on literary Renaissance of the Elizabethan period, please make sure it's the recently published Renaissance Man, The World of Thomas Watson by DVS member Ian Johnson, who will be addressing us soon. So, in the late 1570s and throughout the 1580s, Oxford was not only a busy playwright composing plays for his own company to perform at court, but he was also supporting and encouraging a host of new literary talent. I now hand over to the lovely Rosemary O'Loughlin in the Emerald Isle, who's been on the lookout for any questions that people might have. Rosemary.
Thank you, Kevin, and greetings here from Dublin, Ireland. We will now have 10 minutes for some Q&A before we hand back to Alexander. So if I can just encourage everyone to make sure to type the questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat box. So we already have some questions coming in. Kevin, I'm going to ask you one from Richard Wagaman. He says, is it possible that Munday collaborated with Oxford on the first full English translation of the Decameron? And he thinks that Decameron shows many connections with Shakespeare's works as well as to Munday's works, and Munday was called a one-man translation factory.
I definitely think so. I think that the Decameron's influence on Shakespeare is greatly underestimated. And although there are only 2 or 3 stories which are directly linked, I think that a lot of the themes in the courtly manners seem to derive from the Decameron. So I would definitely think that Oxford's involved in it. Possibly Munday did more of the donkey work and Oxford helped him with more difficult work. But they both travelled in Italy, so I imagine that they were both pretty good at translating Italian. So I would say, Richard, nice to talk to you. Yes, definitely. I would say that Oxford collaborated with Munday on translation of Boccaccio's Decameron.
Thank you, Kevin. I have a question here from Martin Carden, and he asks about Walsingham, who is often portrayed as dour and obviously as a spy master, but seems in fact to have many theatrical and literary influences. What do you think?
Hello, yeah, very interesting question. My impression is hard. I mean, you're asking my opinion on this. My impression is that Walsingham didn't actually like it very much. And I think it's a bit the same with James I. But they thought it was very important because it had such an influence. And James I was happy for these more serious plays to be presented at court because it impressed the ambassadors, impressed some of the nobles. I think Walsingham saw the propaganda value of having the Queen's men under his control and, first of all, instilling a sense of patriotism at court amongst the nobles who might be a bit dissident and might be a bit inclined towards Catholicism or inclined towards Spain, but also to send them off, perhaps in different groups at the same time, in different directions around the country to say, look, this is us, here we are beating the drum. So I'm not sure that Walsingham personally was interested in theatre, but I think he certainly saw the value of it.
Thank you, Kevin. I have a question here from Ron Rothel. Could it be that the Lord Chamberlain's men was patronised in secret by De Vere and not the successive Lords Chamberlain as is assumed?
Well, I think there's slightly different roles involved. I think the Lord Chamberlain's men are licensing, or the Lord Chamberlain is licensing the players and he's encouraging them to appear before court. But what's actually being done with them and the type of plays that's going on, I think Oxford's much more involved in it. There's a big question really what Oxford was doing in the 1590s. We know that he was injured and he didn't travel very far. So I suspect that he was spending more time in the 1590s revising some of the plays. So we go from Hamlet, the short quarto, to the longer one, and other plays like that, as well as writing some fairly sort of despairing tragedies like Timon of Athens and Coriolanus, which don't get a mention anywhere and perhaps might not have been performed. So I think he's certainly involved with them, but I don't know how much of a hands-on role he had compared to what he was doing in the 1580s.
Thank you. Now I'm going to go back to another question from Martin Carden. It's a very interesting question. I've wondered it myself. He's fascinated by the term I can never even pronounce it, silextra, to do with obviously Fisher's Folly, and he wonders, does it have a meaning?
You've got me on that one. I'm afraid I really don't know.
Okay, thank you for that, Kevin. I have a question here from Amanda Hines. Was De Vere genuinely frightened, as Mundy said he was? I presume that must be to do with the earthquake.
Well, most of the earthquake pamphlets said that this was God sort of threatening the country, and the wrath was coming along. And Anthony Mundy talked about grisly murders, linking them up and seeing it all as sort of terrible signs of an impending apocalypse. I'm not sure that Oxford or any of the others were necessarily persuaded about that, but I think that from a point of view of trying to sort of shake up the populace and say, watch out, there is an impending apocalypse, and it's called Spain, and they're constructing their Armada Invencible, their invincible armada, as they still call it. So I'm not sure. I think Alexander's got a stronger viewpoint on that, is that Oxford is writing from a government point of view. Personally, I don't think that he was too affected by the earthquake, but it was certainly sort of quite a big event. And if you're actually in the theatre, and if he was on stage performing Henry V or something, then this would, well, almost brought the house down.
Indeed. Speaking of the earthquake, Kevin, what comes through in Shakespeare's work on the subject of the earthquake?
Well, I was hoping that you were going to ask that one. So if you can go to slide 17, and if we've got Annabelle standing by, we can hear a passage from Shakespeare, and we will see how it appears.
'Tis since the earthquake now 11 years, and she was weaned, I never shall forget it, of all the days of the year upon that day. For I had then laid wormwood to my dug, sitting in the sun under the dove-house wall. My lord and you were then at Mantua. Nay, I do bear a brain. But, as I said, when it did taste the wormwood on the nipple of my dug, and felt it bitter, pretty fool, to see it tetchy and fall out with the dug. Shake, quoth the dove-house, 'twas no need, I trow, to bid me trudge. And since that time It is 11 years.
Now, the nurse repeats the phrase 11 years, and she says it twice. There's no need really for her to say it at all, but she does make a real point of it. And I think such a gratuitous allusion strongly indicates the date of 1591 for at least that passage in Romeo and Juliet, 11 years since an earthquake nearly brought the house down in London.
Thank you, Kevin. I have a question here from Cheryl Egan Donovan. Is there any extant correspondence between the Fisher Folly writers and De Vere?
I think I'm going to have to bow to Alexander, and he will be mentioning that a bit later on.
Okay, thank you. Let me see. I have a question here myself for you, Kevin. What support do you think that Oxford provided in the Fisher's Folly accommodation for the writers?
Right, well, if we can have a look at slide 16, I was wondering about whether to include it. This is my view of what would be needed. Firstly, accommodation, board and lodging, somewhere for them all to eat and sleep. Protection from other people, both out on the streets and from the authorities. Writing materials. I think people underestimate how much writing material that anyone who wrote the works of Shakespeare would get through at the time, and that wasn't cheap. Certainly there's a library involved, and I think people will be encouraged to find out where the books could be bought, and they would be brought in there. Help with research, help with translation, and a kind of a reader's workshop where they would read to each other and say, what do you think about this then, Squire? And say, oh, I'm not sure. Oh, I quite like that one. Oh, I don't like that. Well, you never do. So I think that these writers have got their own individual styles, their own voice, and I think they're helping each other rather than, like Titian's workshop in Venice, where